to give a little bit of a background on this because I decorated last night and I came to put the flowers in today, and everybody that was coming in, including the women, were like, what does this mean? What does that mean? What's going on? Why the colors? So I just wanted to let you know that the sunflower is the official flower of the women's suffragist movement. And what happened was the Kansas delegation of women had picked the sunflower, the state flower, as their flower. And then what happened was when two of the pioneers that did this back in the 1800s had gone through, they saw it and they said, let's just make it the national movement. So then what happened was it caused everybody to wear pins. It was our colors. And then I'll explain more as we go through here. But basically, and the reason that the colors are all here today is the League of Municipalities has asked that all municipalities do something to celebrate the New Jersey ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women right to vote, which is actually this Sunday is the 100th anniversary. So they wanted, some buildings are going to be lit up purple. In our case, I had to do this last night. I didn't know what else to do because we can't really do it here. And so I texted Warren Gabriel, our DPW manager, and I said to him, I said, don't ask questions, but if I wanted to change the light bulbs to make them purple, could we do it? And he writes back to me, I'm getting used to crazy questions like this from you. I just didn't have time because I had so much going on, and I knew the answer was going to be, okay, we could do one in the hallway, we could do one here. So today I walk in and he tells me, oh, by the way, I ordered those bulbs, they were $200, and we'll put them in when they come. And I looked at him like, what? And I said, first of all, we're going to miss the deadline. Second of all, don't spend the money. So then, what else can I tell you? Suffrage, which I didn't know as a kid. I don't know if you guys know this. I always thought suffrage meant women were suffering, and kind of in a way they were when you hear the story. But suffrage comes from the Latin word suffragium, which means to support or ballot or vote or rights of voting. So it's a Latin word, suffrage. And let's see, so then, okay, so the colors, you can see the colors I have on. The movement actually started in the UK, and their colors were purple, white, and green. So the women from the United States that were there brought the idea back, and they changed the colors. And basically, purple is loyalty, which was unswerving loyalty to the cause. White is purity in private and public life. And gold is enlightenment, or the color of light and life. So, and the roses will come in at the very end. The yellow also, sometimes the sunflowers, it's yellow, the color yellow was used. So, with that, Tennessee being the last of the 36 state that they needed, because we only had 48 states at the time, so 3/4 was 36. Tennessee being the last. There were two groups of men. The men that came in wore, if they were against it, they wore red roses. If they were going to vote for it, they wore yellow roses. So it became the War of the Roses. But what ended up happening was, let's just get his name here. There was one young, seemingly rogue, they called him 24-year-old legislator, that came in with a red rose, and he was going to vote no. But what ended up happening, and they tabled the motion, trying to, I guess, kill it till a later session. He voted to table it. Somebody made a motion to table it. He seconded the motion or went along with the motion to table it. But then somehow it came back, and they had to take a vote on it. Something went wrong. I think it was a tie. So what ended up happening was, even though he had the red rose, he had a letter in his pocket from the mother. His mother wrote him a 7-page letter. And all I thought of was you and Jack, that you would do something like this, my sister. At the bottom line is, after the 7-page letter, she wrote to him, be a good boy and do the right thing. And he voted yes. That's what happened. And then they wanted to kill him, it was like a horrible thing. So, and that's how we ended up with all 36 states required to have the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So, that's my story. Oh, and the museum, I just wanted to put up. Sure. I happened to have on a costume that, it got legs. What ended up happening was I wanted an early costume for Halloween, and I figured, okay, 1920 to 2020, suffragist, I'll be that for Halloween. So I got the costume early, figured they're gonna sell out, and then I said, why not have some fun? So, because government can be so dry, and I said, how convenient this is. So I had a lot of fun with it, but my husband is to the point where he I think if he never hears about this again, he's going to be happy, because it's just, that's all I'm talking about. I'm so excited. I'm running through the house. You don't know what I read about these women. You don't know. It's like they went through so much. I'm so inspired. I could never not vote after, you know, if every woman knew and read the story, they would vote. They would never not vote. So with that, I'll just go right into where is it here? I wrote this just a little while ago, so I didn't memorize this part. So the proclamation that I'm about to read is in memory of and celebrates the determination of millions of women who fought for more than 7 decades to secure a woman's right to vote. Their unrelenting and inspiring efforts gave us the 19th Amendment to the Constitution and granted the right to vote. Granted women the right to vote. This right provided the women of their time, as well as future generations, a voice and a seat at the table on matters that affect a woman's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We owe these great women and the men who supported them a debt of gratitude. So with that, I'm going to read you the proclamation, and then at the end I'm going to tell you the story about the War of the Roses, which is a quick story. So, proclamation celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage in the U.S., 1920 to 2020. Whereas the year 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, guaranteeing and protecting a woman's right to vote. And whereas the suffrage movement officially began with the Seneca Falls, New York Women's Rights Convention in 1848 that was convened by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and that framed and began a national discussion about women's rights in America. Whereas this historic convention, which was attended by over 300 people, women as well as men, marked the beginning of a massive civil rights movement that would span the next 70 years. A woman's right to vote was seen as the first step to change the traditional, a woman's right to vote was seen as the first step to change the traditional and unjust systems and inequities women suffered under the legal and political systems. And whereas many women from New Jersey, including Alice Paul, Lucy Stone, Dr. Emma O. Gantz, Marcia Klatchkin, and Rosalie Jones played a crucial role in pursuing the rights of women to vote. And whereas in 1851, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan Brownell Anthony, Susan B. Anthony, who was to become one of the most visible and successful leaders of the American women's suffrage movement. And whereas in the following decades after the Civil War, a split movement of women's organizations, some favoring a state legislative approach and others favoring a national amendment, marched, protested, lobbied, and even went to jail for the cause. And whereas around 1890, Susan B. Anthony helped unify the movement by merging the two largest suffrage associations into one, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, became the primary organization which coordinated dozens of state referendum campaigns appealing directly to the male voters and led hundreds of other campaigns to get the state legislatures to consider suffrage amendments. And whereas meanwhile, New Jersey native Alice Stokes Paul was working and studying in England, where she met Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, who were causing controversy throughout England with their militant tactics to secure the vote for women. And whereas Alice Paul became interested in the issue of women's suffrage after participating with Emmeline Pankhurst in meetings, demonstrations, and depositions to Parliament, leading to multiple arrests, hunger strikes, and forced feedings. Whereas Alice Paul, upon her return to the United States, completed her PhD in economics at the University of Pennsylvania, and then in 1912 turned her attention to the American suffrage movement at a time when it was languishing and lacking focus due to the deaths of two great icons and champions of the movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And whereas Alice Paul joined NAWSA and assumed leadership of its congressional committee in Washington, D.C., and began by organizing the famous suffrage parade on the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, in 1913 that was, which caused the entire city to ignore Wilson's arrival at the Union Station in favor of watching the parade make its way down Pennsylvania Avenue. And whereas when Paul's tactics were seen as too extreme for NAWSA's leadership, she formed her own organization, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, CU, which became the National Women's Party, NWP, in 1916, with the objective of persuading women in suffrage states to elect legislators that favored the federal amendment. Whereas in 1917, the WP began a new tactic that proved to be extremely powerful in changing public sentiment, picketing the White House. And whereas over 2 years, Alice Paul coordinated an ongoing demonstration in front of the White House where thousands of women from across the country, including New Jersey suffragists Allison Turnbull Hopkins, Julia Hulbert, Beatrice Reynolds Kincaid, and Minnie D. Abbott, stood with signs and banners, no matter the weather, as silent sentinels. And whereas public sentiment began to change and spectators passing by became aggressive when the United States entered World War I, and any criticism of the president was seen as unpatriotic. And whereas from 1917 to 1919, over 200 women from 26 states were arrested, imprisoned, and met with violence by the guards and subjected to harsh living conditions. And whereas in response to poor treatment, Alice Paul led the women in protest with hunger strikes that were met by forced feedings so as not to allow any woman to become a martyr for the cause. And this harsh treatment was reported widely in the newspapers, raising the public's awareness of what these strong, independent women they admired were willing to endure to win the vote. And whereas the House of Representatives felt pressure to vote on an amendment that would recognize women's suffrage rights and therefore pass the 19th Amendment on May 21st, 1919, followed by the Senate on June 4th, 1919. And whereas on February 9th, 1920, thanks to the efforts of New Jersey's Alice Paul and other determined leaders of and participants in the suffrage movement, New Jersey proudly became number 29 of the original 36 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. And whereas on August 18th, 1920, Tennessee was the last of the necessary 3/4 36 states to secure ratification, and on August 26, 1920, Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified the 19th Amendment and made it part of the U.S. Constitution, and it reads as, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And whereas shortly after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Margaret Laird and Jenny Van Ness were the first two women elected to the New Jersey Assembly in 1921, and in 1925, Rebecca Estelle Bourgeois Winston of Estelle Manor in Atlantic County was New Jersey's first woman mayor. And whereas, although it is not usually thought about in the following context, it is important to note that because of the effective tactics of these determined women, so many of them from New Jersey, the suffrage movement became the political model for social and political reform movements for the remainder of the 20th century, most notably the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Now therefore, be it resolved, in honor of the 100th anniversary of New Jersey's ratification of the 19th Amendment on February 9th, 2020, Lebanon Township supports the efforts of New Jersey's suffrage centennial and strongly encourages local celebrations of this historic milestone. Be it further resolved, a copy of this resolution will be forwarded to the Governor, Secretary of State, and New Jersey League of Municipalities. And it's going to be signed by all of us. And the story that I wanted to tell on Township Committee, endorse the proclamation celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage in the U.S. 1920-2020.
Second.
Is there a roll call? I would say multiple seconds.
Yeah.
Was that roll? I'm sorry.
Who said roll? Somebody's gonna make a roll call, and I'll say yes.
Either one. Either Brad or myself, we both did, I think.
There was a second, right?
Oh, yeah.
So say roll
Roll
call?
call.
Yes.
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 Yes.